Thank you. As that strange voice in the sky said, I'm Hank Levy, Chair of Computer Science and Engineering at UW, and I'd like to welcome you to the first of the 2015 Engineering Lecture Series, Robots to Web Trackers, Privacy in the Age of Smart Technology. This series is presented in partnership with the College of Engineering and the UW Alumni Association. If you're not a member, I encourage you to visit the UWAA online at uwalum.com to learn more about its memberships. Tonight's lecture considers an issue that's affected pretty much all of us in some form or another, the security and privacy of our personal information. We live in a world where increasingly every device we buy to use in our home or to wear on our body is connected to the internet. And the web today has become an integral part of our lives. We use it for everything from shopping to social networking to ordering drugs and finding medical information relevant to our health. One lab at the UW is working to get ahead of security and privacy issues and to make our information safer and our devices behave the way we expect. Tonight's speaker, Franziska Roesner, is a professor of computer science and engineering at UW. Franzi is a UW alum. She received her PhD in 2014 and joined UW-CSC as a faculty member a little over a year ago. She's well known as an expert in security and privacy for both existing and emerging technologies, including the internet and smartphones and in new augmented reality platforms like Google Glass. She has also worked on security projects at Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. Franzi co-directs the Security and Privacy Research Lab in CSE, along with Yoshi Kono, who will be speaking in the series on November 3rd. It's my privilege to present to you Franziska Roesner.
Okay, thank you, Hank, very much for the introduction. I'm so excited to be here and see all of you out there. My research focuses on computer security and privacy in general, looking at a lot of different devices and technologies. And today I'll give you a little bit of a glimpse into some of the security and privacy issues that we face in many of the technologies that we use in our daily lives. The specific projects that I'll be talking about today and research in general is, of course, a collaborative endeavor. So the projects I'll be talking about were done in collaboration with a lot of great people, both here at the UW and at Microsoft Research. So as we all know, new technologies have the ability to bring tremendous benefits to almost all aspects of our lives. Just in our lifetimes, technology has completely transformed how we interact with each other, how we interact with the world, and in general, how we live our lives. And so that makes this a really exciting field to be working in, and a really exciting time to be observing all of the different technologies that become available and trying them out. Unfortunately, not everything is rosy, as Hank foreshadowed already. New technologies often come with new and serious security and privacy risks. And I'll be giving you a glimpse of some of those throughout the talk today. You probably hear about these things frequently in the news. If you don't already, you'll start noticing it after tonight. But here's a small sampling just from the last few weeks of headlines that talk about security and privacy issues that arise in the web, smartphones, wearable devices, all of the technologies that we know and that we love and that are intended to bring benefits to our lives. The goal of computer security and privacy research is to anticipate these types of issues that arise in existing technologies and to understand them when they do happen. And ultimately, the goal is to develop new technologies that have better security and privacy properties and make those types of design decisions before these technologies become widespread among users of those technologies. Computer security and privacy is, of course, an incredibly broad field that touches every aspect of computer science and engineering. And that's one of the reasons that I really like working in it, because it doesn't require me to become too specific in what I'm looking at. So it's relevant to everything. And in particular, the types of problems that I'm really interested in are ones where security and privacy issues arise because there's a mismatch between what people think is happening in the technologies that they're using and the actual security and privacy properties that those systems or applications have. So I'll give you one concrete example. We'll come back to this throughout the talk. Imagine that someone is using the popular Angry Birds application on their smartphone, playing the Angry Birds game. And imagine that they downloaded this application not from the official app store, but from some random website that they found on the internet. What that person might not realize is that that application is not the real Angry Birds, but a malicious application just pretending to be Angry Birds. And as the user is playing the game, it can secretly do some sneaky things like secretly send costly premium SMS messages or leak sensitive data like location or contact list information to the attacker. And the worst thing about this is that the user doesn't actually have any idea that this is happening. From the user's perspective, they're just playing the Angry Birds game that they intended to play. So as technology designers, we can think about different ways that we can try to mitigate these discrepancies between what people are expecting and what the technologies and the applications are actually doing. There are two high-level ways we can try to mitigate this discrepancy. So on the one hand, we can try to help users change their mental models so that they have a better expectation of what the systems are doing. So in the Angry Birds example, we can help users be more suspicious of applications they download somewhere on the internet and better understand and evaluate those risks. But that can be a lot to ask from users who just want to use these technologies to do something fun. So an alternative approach is to try to change the systems that we're building to better match user expectations in the first place. Both of these approaches are really valuable, and you'll see a lot of examples of them both in the research community and in commercial products. And they work in complement with each other. But today I'll primarily be talking about the second approach. How can we change the way that we build technologies so that we can reduce some of this burden from the user and have better security and privacy properties that actually match people's expectations? So specifically in today's talk, I'll be telling you about two different widespread technologies and some of the invisible and challenging security and privacy risks that arise there and that don't match perhaps your expectations when you use these technologies. I'll first be talking about the web and then about modern operating systems like smartphones. And finally, at the end, I'll loop back and tell you a little bit about some of the challenges we're facing in the future for security and privacy and emerging technologies, and also leave you with some concrete recommendations for things that you can do as you use your devices so that when you leave here today, you don't go home and say, I'm never using a computer again. OK, so let's start with the web, which is, of course, a hugely influential technology that we all use in our daily lives. And I'll tell you today about a widespread privacy risk that's invisible to many users. So you probably have had the following experience. You're browsing somewhere on the web. Maybe you go to Zappos.com to check out some shoes. And then next thing you know, the ads for those shoes are following you everywhere you go. People always laugh when I show you this because this is such an obvious thing that happens to everyone. Here's an example on CNN. Here's an example on The Onion. And so you might have already realized why this is happening, or you might be wondering why this is even possible. What's going on is that advertisers and other entities on the web are tracking your browsing behaviors in order to do things like better target ads to you, show you other types of personalized content, or do analytics for websites so that website owners can know how people are using their site. And these are all good and legitimate intentions, but they also come with privacy concerns. So what you might not realize when you see these ads is that they're not actually loaded from CNN or The Onion. They're loaded from an entirely different entity, in this example called Criteo.com, which is an advertising network. And by loading these ads, your browser gives information to Criteo.com that allows it to link your visits to these different sites. So in other words, Criteo knows that the same user has visited both The Onion and CNN. Criteo might not know exactly who you are, but it can start to build up over time this history of websites that you visited. We call that history of websites a browsing profile for that user. And over time, sites like Criteo can start to build up this set of information about people browsing the internet. Now, at first, you might think, well, I don't really care if Criteo knows that I visit The Onion or CNN or any of the sites that I visit. But you can certainly imagine that there are some people who visit much more sensitive sites who might not be comfortable with some random third party like Criteo knowing about that. So in fact, within the policy world and the media and the academic computer science research community, there's been a lot of privacy concern associated with these types of tracking practices. So one of the earliest big articles about these issues was in the Wall Street Journal in about 2010 or 2011. They published an expose on web tracking and the associated privacy concerns. This series is called the What They Know series, and it's still online at the Wall Street Journal. You can check that out if you want to learn a little bit more about it. But one of the things that they raised, for example, in this article is that not only does this practice of web tracking allow these third parties like Criteo to collect information about your browsing history, it can also use that information to infer additional personal information about you, like your age, your gender, and your other interests. In fact, privacy concerns were so great that a couple of years ago there was a proposal brought before Congress called Do Not Track. And the goal of that proposal was to allow users to have an effective opt-out mechanism if they don't want to be tracked like this by entities on the internet. Do Not Track as a policy proposal was never successful, but I'll mention later that Do Not Track as a technical option in your browser is something that actually exists and something that you can enable. Okay, so this is back in about 2011. There was a lot of growing concern about the privacy issues surrounding web tracking. And when we started looking at this here at the UW, we realized that although there was a lot of discussion of these tracking mechanisms and the concerns, nobody really understood exactly how it worked. Nobody outside of the companies that are doing this tracking. And so our goal at the time was to systematically study this web tracking ecosystem to understand how different tracking mechanisms work, how effective different defenses are that are available to users who want to install something in their browser, for example, to protect themselves, and generally how widespread and serious this practice is. Studying this was actually challenging because, as I've already implied, there was not really an agreed upon definition of what tracking actually is. So first we had to spend some time actually understanding what was going on in the browser, how different websites interact with each other, and what that actually means in terms of privacy. And so before doing that, nobody had any automated way of detecting tracking. So if we wanted to measure how tracking works in the wild, we didn't really have anything to go on. So I sometimes compare this to being a biologist and going out and looking at different types of fish. It's hard to count how many fish there are if you don't even know what a fish looks like. So first of all, we had to figure that out. So the way we did this is following an approach that's pretty typical in computer security and privacy research of this type. One of the types of things that we do is try to measure phenomena that are going on in the real world, as is the case with tracking on the web. So first we had to manually analyze how these different tracking mechanisms work and try to understand exactly what was going on and what that meant for the capabilities of the trackers. The result of that was that we published a taxonomy of different types of tracking behaviors. I'll give you some of the highlights from that taxonomy today. It turns out that the tracking ecosystem is remarkably complicated, and different types of trackers have different capabilities. With that taxonomy, we were then able to systematically and automatically measure tracking on the web and understand how big of an issue it actually is. And ultimately, the goal of many of the things we do is to take all of that information and inform the design of new defenses that privacy-sensitive users can actually use. So I'll tell you about one of the tools that we built today. Before I go further on web tracking in particular, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on how the web works to make sure that we're all on the same page. The most important thing to know is that websites can store information in your browser in the form of what's called a browser cookie. You can think of a cookie as just a small text file that contains a little bit of information, and websites use that very commonly across the web. The purpose of a cookie is to allow the website to be able to re-identify you when you come back to that page. And that's how many of the things work on the web today. So for example, when you have your Amazon shopping cart, the reason that Amazon knows who you are as you go from page to page is because Amazon has stored a cookie in your browser that allows it to re-identify you when you come back. So websites commonly use this. They often re-identify you by storing sort of anonymous, unique identifiers. So these are sort of fake examples here, but in this example, we have The Onion and CNN. They've both set some sort of cookie in your browser. In reality, these cookies would be much longer strings of random numbers, but just for illustration purposes. There are a couple of important things about these cookies. One is that they're only accessible to the sites that set them. So that means that CNN and The Onion can't read each other's cookies. But more importantly for tracking, the browser automatically includes these cookies with any requests that it makes. So when you go and open a web page to theonion.com, what's happening is that your browser is communicating with theonion.com servers. The Onion has computers somewhere that are serving its website. And your browser will automatically include the Onion's cookie with that request. And similarly with all of the other requests that your browser makes to load pages. So this basic mechanism is what allows this type of tracking that I've been talking about to happen. So let's look again at The Onion and CNN, but now let's think about what happens when we have this ad embedded inside these pages that is coming from Criteo.com. As I mentioned earlier, these ads are not loaded from The Onion or CNN, but from Criteo.com. So as your browser loads this ad, it talks to Criteo.com's servers, automatically includes Criteo's cookie. Criteo's cookie will be the same wherever Criteo ads show up. And as a result, Criteo is able to identify that the same user has visited all of the sites from which it receives that cookie. So over time, Criteo can build what we call this browsing profile. In this scenario, The Onion and CNN are what we call first parties, because those are websites that the user has actually intentionally visited. Those are the sites that you type into your browser and go to willingly. Criteo and other ads embedded inside those pages are what we call third parties, because those are entities that the user doesn't even know about. When you see this page, you can't tell that that ad is coming from Criteo or that it might be coming from somewhere else. So this is actually the basic way that tracking works. Trackers use cookies to re-identify you, and when they appear in these third-party positions, your browser automatically makes those requests and includes those cookies. That is the basic 101 for tracking, and that is what most people mean when they talk about third-party web tracking. And that's what most people meant back in 2011 when we first started looking at this. What we found, though, is that in practice, tracking is much more complicated than this. This is a type of tracking that we call vanilla tracking. It's the most basic. But there are many other ways in which trackers can communicate with each other or store information in the browser to be able to re-identify you and create these browsing profiles. And as a result of their different behaviors, trackers have different capabilities and different resilience to defenses. So I won't go into our entire tracking taxonomy today, but there is one additional type of tracking that we found particularly interesting in our investigation, and that you might recognize when I show you. So looking again at this screenshot of The Onion, we know already that Criteo has served this embedded Zappos ad. But Criteo is actually not the only tracker on this page. You might notice down here that we also have these embedded social media widgets, like the Facebook like button and the Twitter tweet button and the Google +1 button. You've likely seen these types of buttons as you browse the web. What you might not have realized is that these buttons actually allow the associated social media site to track you just in the same way that Criteo can with that ad. I'll show you more specifically how that works in just a minute. We call these types of trackers personal trackers because they're often linked to your social media accounts, which are not anonymous, rather than unique identifiers that are anonymous. So to show you more specifically how this works, this will look pretty familiar. It's a pretty similar flow. The main difference is that the tracker is now also a website that you visit directly intentionally as a first party. So to take Facebook as an example, maybe you intentionally go to visit facebook.com and check out your news feed. Facebook, as all other websites, uses a cookie to re-identify you. And now that cookie is linked to your actual Facebook account and not just some anonymous unique identifier. Now when you browse the web and you visit sites like The Onion and CNN, when you see the Facebook like button included in these pages, what's actually happening is that to load this button, your browser is communicating with Facebook. And when it does that, just as before, it automatically includes Facebook's cookie with that request. And it allows Facebook over time to be able to link your visits to all of the different sites that include the Facebook like button. And what's important to realize here is that this is possible even if you never actually click on the like button. It's the mere fact that your browser is loading that button in the first place, and in loading it has to communicate with Facebook, that leaks this information to Facebook. These personal trackers were interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that, as I've mentioned, they're not anonymous. So they might be able to link your browsing history with other information that you've intentionally entered on their site, like your social media profile. The other thing that was interesting about these trackers is that because of the way they work, they're actually able to evade certain defenses. Because you sometimes visit Facebook.com directly, your browser treats it differently than it treats entities like Criteo that only ever show up inside other sites. One of the most serious consequences of that is that third-party cookie blocking, which you may have heard of and which I'll mention later as a possible defense for tracking. Third-party cookie blocking works well for many types of tracking, but it does not work for these personal trackers precisely because you sometimes visit those sites directly. OK, so I've given you examples of two different types of tracking that are subtly different and have different implications. Once we had categorized these trackers, we were interested in how much of this is going on, how effective are existing defenses, and how is the privacy of real users actually affected by these behaviors. So we built an automated tool that browses the web and detects and classifies different types of tracking behavior according to our taxonomy. We later released that tool and have since still been building on it. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about this tool in particular, it's called Tracking Observer, and we have the source code and all the details about it online there. OK, so moving on to giving you some highlights from our measurement results. The first thing we were interested in was how many trackers are there? How many companies like Criteo are out there that are doing these types of things? And the answer was that there are actually surprisingly many companies that are doing this kind of thing. We looked at the top 500 websites, so the websites that are most popular in terms of how many people visit them. We looked at both the home pages of those websites as well as 4 additional links somewhere inside those pages. And we found over 500 unique trackers, so companies like Criteo and Facebook, that were included on these 500 sites. So to us, that was actually a surprisingly large number of different third parties that you might encounter as you're browsing these popular sites. We also found that websites tend to include multiple trackers. So what this graph is showing you is what percentage of websites include how many trackers. So I'll give you some specific interesting data points on the graph. We found that most sites include at least one tracker. So almost all sites are including trackers for advertisement or analytic purposes. Half of sites include between 4 and 5 trackers. And then in the extreme, we saw one site that included 43 unique trackers. So a user visiting that site might be surprised that there are 43 different third parties that are observing his or her visit to that site. These specific numbers that I've shown you were actually from 2011. We've since been rerunning some of these measurements. And one of the things that we found is that tracking is actually increasing both in prevalence and complexity. So just to give you one highlight from that comparison, looking again at the number of unique trackers we find, here we're only looking at the home pages of sites, not these additional 4 links. So that's why the 2011 numbers don't match up. But this is the number of unique trackers in 2011, 2013, and just a couple of months ago in 2015 that appear on these top 500 websites. And so you can see we are now we started at about 383 on those top 500 sites, and we've increased to 512. And we see this across other measurement metrics as well, that the tracking ecosystem is getting both more complicated, but also larger. OK, so we weren't just interested in how many trackers there are, but how much they actually affect the privacy of real users. So we wanted to know, a user who is browsing the web, how much of their browsing history can the most popular trackers actually capture? This was challenging to measure because we needed some way of either collecting or approximating real user browsing behaviors. We needed a list of sites that a real user might visit. One thing we could have done is instrument real users' browsers and collect their browsing history, but we weren't really comfortable with doing that for the obvious privacy reasons. And we might also worry that if we have instrumented people's browsers as part of a study, that they might not browse in the way that they normally do when they're not being observed by us. Fortunately, one thing that we realized is that there is other data out there that we can use to help us with this measurement. In particular, the AOL search logs were released several years before our study. The AOL search logs were actual searches that were done by real AOL users. And those logs were released and available. And so what we did was actually use those search logs to create approximated or hypothetical browsing histories for users. So what we did is we picked 30 of the AOL users for which we had search logs. We took 300 of their unique search queries, searched them on today's search engine, and then used the resulting top search result as an entry in their hypothetical browsing history. So we end up with 30 lists of websites that these 30 different users might have visited. These aren't exact browsing histories from real users, but because they're based on the underlying AOL search data, they're at least somewhat representative of the types of things or the types of sites that real users might visit. So what do we find? We find that the top trackers in our data capture a surprisingly large fraction of the browsing histories of our hypothetical users. So these are the top 3 trackers in our data set. We find that DoubleClick, which is Google's ad network, can capture on average about 40% of one of these users' browsing histories. So 40% of the sites that one of these users might visit has an ad from DoubleClick on it. Facebook and Google, which are both personal trackers, so they might not be tracking anonymously if the user is logged into Facebook or Google, can capture about 1/5 to 1/4 of these users' browsing histories. So for privacy-sensitive users, these percentages might be alarmingly large. And furthermore, one thing that's interesting in computer security and privacy is that sometimes the adversary that you're concerned about can change. So the assumptions you make might change. So for example, you might think, well, OK, I don't really care if Facebook and Google know which sites I'm visiting. I already trust those sites. I have relationships with them. I sign up for accounts with them. Well, some people might be more concerned to know that other entities are also using this tracking information. So one particular example, about a year or 2 ago, people found out that the NSA was reportedly also using Google's tracking cookies, observing the requests that people's browsers were making to also track users in this way. So this type of tracking behavior has implications beyond the specific entities that are doing the tracking. OK, so who are these top trackers? This graph shows you the top 20 trackers in our data set at the time. The height of the bar shows you how many of the top 500 websites we found that tracker on. So the top ones here are DoubleClick, Facebook, and Google, as I mentioned before. And you'll see some other familiar names in there, like Twitter, advertising.com, YouTube, and so on. The color of the bar is distinguishing these different types of trackers that I told you about. The black bars are vanilla trackers. They just use basic cookies, and they're like Criteo. The red bars are the personal trackers that have these social media widgets like Facebook and Google. And these are the ones that might not be tracking anonymously. One of the things we were really interested in was how effective existing defenses were, either different types of browser extensions that users could install or different types of browser settings and so on. What we found was that many defenses were effective for this vanilla type of tracking, but they were not effective for personal trackers. So this is what our graph looks like when we use the commonly recommended defenses. We still have these red bars. You'll notice there's also still one black bar up there. That's actually because that tracker is a tracking type I didn't tell you about, and it's still there because of how it interacts with some of the red trackers here. So just to give you a sense of how complicated and nuanced this tracking ecosystem is. So there were no good defenses for these personal trackers like Facebook and Google at the time. Users had 2 choices. They could either accept these buttons and allow Facebook, Google, Twitter to observe their browsing histories, Or they could install something that would completely block the buttons so that you would never see a Facebook like button or a Twitter tweet button ever as you browse the web. And that might be fine for some people who say, well, why would I ever want to like something on Facebook? But for users who want to sometimes like a page but preserve their privacy when they don't choose to click on the button, there wasn't a middle ground option. So this is where we realized that there was an opportunity for a new defense. So we implemented something called Share Me Not. The idea of Share Me Not is to let you have your cake and eat it too with respect to these social media widgets. Very simply, it blocks tracking by social media widgets when you have not chosen to click on them. However, it doesn't remove them from the web page. At a very high level, the way Share Me Not works is it replaces those real Facebook and Twitter buttons with fake ones that don't communicate with Facebook and Twitter. You, as a user, can still see that button, choose to click on it, and then Share Me Not will take care of communicating the like or the tweet or whatever it is back to the social media site. So Share Me Not filled this gap in defenses that we only really were able to identify when we systematically studied the tracking ecosystem and measured the effectiveness of existing defenses. And Share Me Not has had a nice life going forward since its initial conception. Initially, its techniques were adopted by Ghostery, which is a popular anti-tracking add-on. It's one of the ones that I'll recommend later in the talk. And then last summer, I worked with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a nonprofit digital rights organization that was building a new anti-tracking add-on that was a little more comprehensive than Share Me Not. And I worked with them to incorporate Share Me Not's techniques into that. So that it was nice in two ways. First of all, I was no longer personally on the hook for fixing bugs in Share Me Not. But also, now many more people use Share Me Not through the EFF's tool, which is called Privacy Badger. I'll show you the link for that in just a moment. OK, so that's where I'll stop with talking about web tracking and move on to another topic. Just to summarize what I've told you about so far, I told you about web tracking as an invisible privacy concern on the web that many users don't know about. And in fact, when we studied this starting back in 2011, we found that tracking was both prevalent and complicated. And by studying it, we were able to identify a need for a new defense, which we realized in Share Me Not. The EFF tool that incorporates Share Me Not's techniques is called Privacy Badger. The link is down there, or if you just search on a search engine for EFF Privacy Badger, you should be able to quickly find it. That is certainly a tool that I would recommend if you're concerned about web tracking, and I'll mention that again at the end. Since then, we've continued to study the web tracking ecosystem. As I mentioned, we've seen increasing prevalence and complexity of tracking. So this is a topic that we're still interested in and learning about. OK, so I'd like to shift my focus to another prevalent technology that we all use in our daily lives, or many of us use in our daily lives, which is modern operating systems, and particularly, I'll focus on smartphones. Security in the smartphone ecosystem is far from solved. Let me give you a couple of examples of the types of things that commonly go wrong. First of all, users are easily tricked into installing malicious applications. I mentioned the Angry Birds example earlier. Malicious applications often come in the form of fake versions of real applications. So it's really hard for people to tell the difference between what's a good and what's a bad application. So on the surface, these malicious apps act exactly in the way that users would expect. But under the hood, they're doing malicious things like leaking location data or sending premium SMS messages that cost the users money. It turns out that even legitimate applications often act in ways that people don't expect. So many studies have shown that legitimate smartphone applications commonly leak sensitive information to advertisers or other third parties. A very similar story to what we see on the web with trackers there. So for example, one study that was partially done at the UW found that almost half of the Android applications that they looked at sent sensitive location or phone identification information to advertising or analytics servers. So again, these are things that are happening under the hood in a way that users are often not even aware. So if we step back and think about why we have all of these problems in the smartphone ecosystem, you'll constantly see new headlines about different malware that's coming up for these smartphone systems. The reason we have these problems is not because smartphone designers haven't been trying to do a good job at security. In fact, smartphone systems are already much more secure than traditional older versions of operating systems that we used to use. So one of the major things that these systems do is that they actually isolate applications from each other and from the system itself. What that means is when you install a smartphone application, by default, it doesn't have the ability to do sensitive things like access your camera, access your microphone, access your GPS location. And that prevents malicious applications from just doing whatever they want with all of these sensitive resources. Of course, the applications that we use do need to use these types of resources to carry out their legitimate functionality. You couldn't use a Maps application if it couldn't access your GPS location. So a fundamental problem that these operating systems face is that they need to decide when it's OK for an application to do something like take a picture or access the location, and when that's not OK. And it turns out it's really hard to determine what's OK and what's not. So what these systems typically do today is just ask users explicitly to make those decisions. If you use a smartphone, you'll be really familiar with this. So let me show you a couple of examples so you know what I'm talking about. One of the ways that this is often done is with what's called a runtime prompt. So you'll see this if you use iOS. That's what that top picture is. Or many browsers also do this when websites try to access location. You'll see a prompt that says, is it OK for this application to do this, which might be access your location or access the camera or access the microphone. And as a user, you have to decide, is this OK, and click yes or no. You probably know from your own experience that these prompts are incredibly disruptive. Usually you're doing something that you actually wanted to do in the app, and suddenly this prompt pops up, and you just click it away to get it out of your face and do whatever you were trying to do. And studies have shown that in practice, people don't really pay attention to these prompts, and so they don't provide their intended security benefit. The other commonly used approach is what's called a manifest. The idea of the manifest is that when you install an application, you will see the entire list of permissions that that application wants to use. This is used by systems like Android and Windows Phone. So if you use Android, that will look familiar on the right there. And the user's role is to read this list of permissions, decide if they seem reasonable for the application, and then click accept and download or refuse to install the application at all. So one important thing here is that you don't have a choice whether you can say yes or no to different things in this list. You have to accept the entire list for that application or not install the application at all. And this doesn't work well either for a lot of reasons. So at this point, I often like to take a poll. So I'm going to ask you all two questions. So after the first question, I'll ask you to keep your hand up, because we'll see the difference between the responses to the two questions. So the first question is, please raise your hand if you use an Android or a Windows phone. OK, great. Leave your hands up. So quite a lot of you. Now, please leave your hand up if you regularly click no because these permissions make you nervous. Yeah, so many fewer hands. Actually, those of you who have left your hands up are sufficiently paranoid. Good for you. Right, so again, studies have shown that people don't really understand these manifests. People don't understand what these permissions exactly mean. People are trying to install the application. They don't really read it. They just click through what they are trying to do. And it's not really fair to ask people to make these decisions at installation time, because you don't know yet if it's reasonable for this application to access, say, your location, if you don't know exactly what the application does yet. So in practice, neither prompts nor manifests work really well. These are actually the two state-of-the-art approaches that are used by most systems. And so in practice, they're actually overly permissive. One additional problem, other than that they're just hard to use, is that they give applications too many capabilities. Once you say yes to one of these prompts or to the manifest, applications have the ability to use those permissions whenever and however they want. There's no guarantee that something you're doing in the application, like clicking on the Find My Location button, is actually linked to the application's use of these permissions. So as far as you know, the application can be secretly taking pictures or accessing your location, even if you're not using the application at all. So from both a usability and a security perspective, these state-of-the-art approaches are really not that great. So in collaboration with Microsoft Research, we explored an alternate permission granting approach that we call user-driven access control. The key idea with user-driven access control is that the way that people naturally use applications actually already has a lot of information about permissions, if only we could extract that information. So for example, if you're using a Maps application like I've shown up here, you might click on this location button in the top right. And when you click there, what you mean intuitively is that this application should be allowed to access your location now. If your smartphone system then pops up a prompt that says, can this application use your location? You'll think, well, yes, obviously, I just clicked the location button. And just as importantly, if you haven't clicked the location button, you would prefer that the application doesn't access your location. So this location example is not a contrived one. When we started looking at this, we realized that there are actually many examples of user interface elements or buttons in applications that have this property, that they are related to a user's intuition about what resources are being accessed. So for example, if you click on a video call button, intuitively what you mean is give the application access to the camera or the microphone. If you click on a paste button, you expect that the application will access your clipboard. Or, as we talked about earlier, if you click on the like button, you expect that Facebook will learn about your visit to the site that is showing you the like button. But if you don't click on the like button, you expect that Facebook isn't learning anything. So user-driven access control is a nice intuitive idea, but this is not how today's systems work, as I've already shown you. What we found, though, in a user study is that many people think that this is how it works, or how it should work, at least. So many people that we surveyed thought that applications can't, or at least shouldn't, be able to access, for example, your camera if you haven't clicked on a camera button. So this is a nice idea, but it's not how today's systems work. The reason it's not how today's systems work isn't because nobody ever thought of this idea before, but because it's actually really hard to get this to work. So I'm going to dive a little bit into how today's operating systems work when users interact with applications. What I've shown you here is the user's view of the world on the left. The user is using some sort of photo editing application. On the right, I've shown you what the operating system knows is happening right now. The operating system knows that it's running this photo editing application. It knows that the photo editing application has some permissions. Maybe the user granted those at installation time. And those permissions include the camera. Now, when the user is using the photo editing app, the user might click on that included camera button. What happens is that the operating system will detect that click, and it will send it to the photo editing application. At this point, the photo editing application might do something reasonable, like, well, take a picture. So it might ask the operating system to access that camera and take a photo for the user. This all seems fine. What I've shown you here, importantly, is a well-behaved application. There is nothing stopping this application from accessing the camera at a time that has nothing to do with when the user is clicking on the button. The second important thing in this example is that there is nothing that allows the operating system to tell the difference between when is a good time and when is a bad time. As far as the operating system is concerned, this camera button is some random thing some application drew inside of its user interface, and the operating system doesn't know that that's a camera button. So it can't enforce anything about any link between the user's click on the camera button and the access to the camera. So fundamentally, today's systems can't understand users' interactions with applications and can't turn those into permission information. That's why in today's systems, at this point, the application has to say, well, I don't know what the user is trying to do, so let me show them a prompt to see if this actually is OK. So the challenge we were facing in making user-driven access control practical was to design a system such that the operating system actually can understand the user's interactions with arbitrary buttons in arbitrary applications. We weren't the first to think of something like user-driven access control. There were many other approaches previously that had tried to implement something similar. But unfortunately, many of these were very specific. So they looked only at access to files in the file system or access to the clipboard. One of our goals was to support this idea of user-driven access control in a really general way so that we can support all types of resources like cameras, microphones, and files, and the clipboard. So the key thing that makes user-driven access control work in our system is our new operating system primitive that we call an access control gadget. This is a word that we invented. We call it an ACG. But essentially, we take these user interface elements that I've shown you already, these things that I've circled in red. Today in applications, these buttons belong entirely to the application. In our modified system, we take these buttons and make them special. We give control of those buttons to the operating system, and now we call them access control gadgets, or ACGs. So the way this works is that now when an application wants to access the camera, for example, that application has to explicitly include this special button that will give it access to the camera when users click it. And so by making these buttons special and pulling them out of the applications, we can now allow the operating system to understand what the buttons mean and detect when users click on them. So let me show you how this actually plays out and how we can get these properties that we want. So again, we have the user's view of the world and the operating system's view of the world. In addition to the photo editing app, we're now going to introduce a second trusted application. We'll talk about the camera as an example. So we have what's called a camera resource monitor. This is something new that we're introducing. And the camera resource monitor is trusted by the operating system to manage access to the camera and to expose a set of buttons, or ACGs. Now, when the photo editing application wants to have a button, or wants to access the camera, it uses one of these buttons provided by the camera resource monitor. This is now a special camera ACG. And it simply includes that button in its user interface. If you're familiar with web programming, this works similar to how you would embed an iframe. Now, the user, when they click on that button, that click is no longer routed to the photo editing application, but to the trusted camera resource monitor. And now the camera resource monitor accesses the camera and shares, in this example, only that one photo with the photo editing application. So you'll notice now that the photo editing application no longer has blanket camera permissions. It cannot access the camera. It can only receive camera information through this camera resource monitor, which is enforcing this policy that this only happens when the user actually clicks on the button. So this is the high-level idea with user-driven access control and access control gadgets. In practice, it turns out that there are many other challenges in making this work in practice. In fact, you might be thinking of some of them. For example, what if the photo editing application doesn't want the button that the camera resource monitor is exposing? What if it wants a completely funky new camera button? How can we support that? So we face all sorts of challenges in doing this, and I will not talk about them in detail now, but if anybody has questions, I'd be happy to dive into it a little bit more later. But at a high level, user-driven access control is really nice because it gives us better usability and better security properties. We now limit application permissions more than we did before, and we do it in a way that matches people's expectations. We no longer have to ask users to make explicit permission-granting decisions. The user-driven access control idea is one that is very powerful, and we've been taking it in different directions since then. So a couple of examples. User-driven access control works really well for today's smartphone applications, where you are actually explicitly interacting with your apps. But there are many new devices coming on the market where applications automatically do things for you. These are things like Google Glass or Microsoft HoloLens, for example, where you have apps that are continuously sensing the real world and automatically doing things for you. And so one of the directions that we went from user-driven access control is rethinking how this type of permission system should work when people aren't actually interacting with their devices that much and things are happening automatically. We've also been looking with Hank, actually, at trying to provide better guarantees. Right now, what I've described to you, user-driven access control, will only ensure that the application only accesses a picture when you click the button. Once the application has the picture, all bets are off. It can do whatever it wants with that picture. But we can do some more sophisticated things to actually enforce even stricter policies, to say, for example, that picture can only ever be shared with your friends. And finally, we're thinking about how we can do user-driven access control in a more lightweight way. What I've shown you required fundamental changes to the operating system, which makes it unlikely that Google, for example, is going to release a fundamentally different version of Android in which all applications need to change to suddenly support this. That seems unlikely, so we're looking at how to give users similar guarantees without having to make so many changes to the operating system or even the applications. OK, so I've told you about permission granting as a fundamental problem in the smartphone ecosystem. A lot of the security and privacy concerns related to smartphones stem in some way fundamentally from this problem. And so with user-driven access control, we can better protect users' sensitive information in a way that's also more usable and more lightweight. This idea of user-driven access control is one that I really like because I think it's a great example of the idea that I mentioned earlier in the talk, which is that we can change the way our systems and our technologies work to make them automatically meet user expectations rather than putting this burden on users to try to understand and manage these risks themselves. OK, finally, I'd like to conclude by telling you a little bit about future challenges in computer security and privacy, and also leaving you with some concrete recommendations for what you can do if I have sufficiently freaked you out. So looking forward, computer security and privacy is a really exciting field to be working in. As our world is becoming more computerized and interconnected, these issues are becoming more and more important. And so in addition to dealing with all of the security and privacy concerns that arise in the technologies we've already deployed, we have the opportunity to look at them in new emerging technologies. So for example, I'm very interested in security and privacy for emerging augmented reality technologies like Google Glass or Microsoft HoloLens, wearables and other types of continuously sensing devices, automatically, or rather teleoperated robots, autonomous vehicles. Everywhere you see technology developing, there are potential security and privacy issues. And what's really exciting about working on these issues in emerging technologies is that we really have the opportunity to positively influence designs, so address many of these issues before these technologies become widespread. OK, so if you are concerned about some of the things that I've talked about today and you want to go home and actually do something, let me give you a couple of concrete things you can do. So I mentioned a few things already for web tracking. If you're concerned about your privacy on the web, there are two basic things you can do. One is to check out your browser settings. There are various things in there that can help you protect your privacy, like blocking third-party cookies or enabling do not track, which, as I mentioned, failed as a policy proposal, but browsers implemented it nevertheless, and many of the popular trackers actually adhere to it. You can also, outside of your browser, install third-party privacy-preserving browser extensions. You can find these if you use Chrome, for example, in the Chrome Web Store, or Firefox also has a store for these add-ons. Things like Privacy Badger, Ghostery, and AdBlock are ones that I would recommend that help with this problem. Unfortunately, actually, none of these solutions are 100% perfect for various reasons. I've mentioned a few of them, and that's why tracking as such is still an open research question in the academic community. But using these various things will certainly help. If you're concerned about malicious or invasive smartphone applications, there are a couple of things you can do. One is to install applications primarily from trusted sources, so from the actual Google or Apple app stores, for example. and be cautious about installing applications from some random place on the web, like the malicious Angry Birds example that I mentioned. And I've talked to you a lot about permissions. Applications, of course, need these permissions to do legitimate things. But I would caution you to at least take a look at the permissions that applications are asking for and decide if they seem reasonable for what the application is actually doing. And then finally, general best practices, which I'm sure many of you know, but just to remind you, these things can always help. Using strong passwords, using different passwords on different websites, using two-factor authentication for accounts that support it. This is where you use both a password and a second device like your phone to authenticate. And finally, keeping your systems and your applications up to date. As vulnerabilities are discovered, application developers and system developers will fix these things. You won't get those fixes if you don't update. So these are all things that you actually can go home and do right now. At the same time, in the research community, we are trying to anticipate the new security and privacy challenges that will arise with emerging technologies. And hopefully, we're always working towards a safer future. So in conclusion, I've given you a glimpse into computer security and privacy issues with the web and with smartphones, which are some of the most pervasive technologies that we use in our daily lives. As our world is becoming more computerized and interconnected, all of these issues are becoming more and more important. But fortunately, the people who design technologies can mitigate these issues by doing things like designing systems that better match user expectations and thinking carefully about how we build our systems and communicate this stuff to users. I will stop there. I'd be happy to take questions. Again, this work was done in collaboration with many, many people. These are the people who worked specifically on the work that I talked about today. And so thanks very much to them. And thanks very much to all of you for your attention. I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.